I doubted the resurrection. This is the disciples because they did not believe the women. For the women returned to the upper room to let the disciples know what had taken place at the tomb. And the disciples didn't believe them. In fact, they thought the women were talking nonsense. It wasn't until later when they had their own personal encounter with the risen Lord, as he appeared before them in that locked room, that they truly believed the news. Jesus had been raised from the dead. And this second stage of faith that we mentioned earlier is that of encounter. Friends, at some point in our walk of faith, we have had to have had our own personal encounter with Jesus. One of the dangers that we fall into with the mission of the church is that we become so transfixed with systems and fashions that we often forget that our mission is a simple one. It's to introduce people to Christ so that they might have their own personal encounter with the risen Lord. So when was your encounter? When did you meet with Jesus? I've had many over the years, but the very first one that I recall that shaped my life, it happened actually on a coach journey when Gravesend Citadel Band were travelling back after a weekend at St Albans, and they were travelling from St Albans back to Gravesend. And on that coach journey, I remember it as clearly as anything, I heard God speak to me and say very simply, Cliff, become an officer. And it was so clear that I looked around to see who was talking to me, but there was nobody. And that's when I knew it was God. It took me a while to answer him, but that was my very first encounter with this living Jesus. Why do I believe in the risen Lord Jesus Christ? It was because of that encounter with him and the friendship that we have shared ever since. For many of us, those encounters have happened in our worship services. But as with my story, they shouldn't be confined to those worship services alone. He meets us in all manner of places, in the middle of all manner of activities. He meets us when things are going well and when things are pretty dark. And often that encounter is just something that happens. It's not something that we can manufacture. Right out of the blue, Jesus is there. Perhaps that's one of the lessons from the resurrection, that he turns up when you least expect him, even behind locked doors. Now, in that novel that I've written, Charlie Atkinson rediscovers his faith through the life story of his three friends that he's on holiday with. But he then encounters God once more whilst climbing Mount Snowdon. So, my friends, where and when was your own personal encounter with Jesus Christ? Can you truly sing, I know that my Redeemer lives? Do you know the living Lord Jesus?